Black powder. I don't talk about it a lot. Perhaps I should talk about it more because I recently put a poll up on Patreon and I quickly took it down because I forgot to make a multiple choice. But in areas of interest, somebody hit black powder. So it's been a while since I've talked about black powder, so that's what I want to talk about today. Welcome to the podcast where I talk about guns, gunfighting, tactics, ballistics, even old school black powder stuff. The right way, with God Almighty at the center, biblical, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. With that, I'm blessed to serve you as host, military, law enforcement, private security, contracting, hunting, background, competition shooting. Now, on the black powder side, I have hunted with black powder successfully. I have competed. I've won at least one competition in black powder. I used to do the old Mountain Man rendezvous, which are a lot of fun. If you don't know what that is, you might want to look it up. You dress up and do the whole thing where you go out and compete. And I did it mostly for the competitions, hatchet throwing, knife throwing, black powder. They also do traditional archery, which I wasn't into at the time. But so I have competed in it as well. I took, I don't know what year I was. I was a teenager when I took my first deer with black powder. I don't think I've taken one with it since then, but I guess we'll start there. That's a big reason people use black powder today. In a lot of places, there are special muzzleloader only seasons. There are where I live as well. However, you don't get an extra tag. Like in a lot of places, you get extra hunting in. Where I live, it's not so. You get to hunt your regular tag and then you get extra early or late season black powder. It's generally you have to pick. So do you want a black powder tag or do you want a regular rifle tag? And I like to practice with stuff that I might actually need to use, which is much more likely to be, regular rifles. So I haven't done a lot of black powder hunting recently, but that's a big reason it's still popular today. In a lot of places, you get extra or you get an additional opportunity to hunt. Not so much in the place where I live. There is some of that, but it's nowhere near like back east where you get like an extra tag or something or extra long season in addition to your rifle hunting and all that stuff. But that is big in much of the country and much of the East Coast, which is where most of you guys live. So there's the extra thing, and that keeps black powder alive and well here. On that, a lot of people, you can see that they really take advantage of that, mostly for the extra opportunity. They don't care so much about the history because a lot of the black powder stuff today, or the muzzle loader, because a lot of it doesn't even use black powder, which I'll probably get into, but a lot of the muzzle loader seasons, they're just in name only. There's nothing historic about it because they're completely modern firearms that use modern primers like a 209 shotgun primer. They're inline. They don't have a lock. I used to say lock, stock, and barrel. They don't have that. It's a modern inline, completely modern firearm that's a single shot, basically. But they use completely different technology. They use a modern primer. They're inline. They'll a lot of times use a sabot, which is a sub-caliber projectile going at much higher velocity. So it's just a workaround for people to get extra hunting in, which I'm all fine with, right? If there's enough deer, let people do it. But there's really not much in black. A lot of them don't even use black powder, so they're not black powder firearms. I just thought I'd touch on that. But if we talk about the historic, and some jurisdictions do legislate in a black powder season or a muzzleloader season, you have to use black powder. They do in my state. If you're going to hunt with it, it has to be like a traditional side lock, no sub-caliber projectiles. It has to be a black powder or black powder equivalent, which let's get into that. Black powder or black powder equivalent, you're talking traditional black powder, and black powder is 75% saltpeter. There is some charcoal and some sulfur in there. But it's a real basic, easy to make and produce on your own if you want to. Very simple chemical compound that's been around a long, long time. For much of firearms history, it was black powder. Black powder is very dirty. It makes a lot of smoke, hence the term for modern powder is smokeless powder. It's also pretty corrosive and bad on firearms, and it pretty much has that same chemical property. It's not like modern propellants where you get a bunch of different formulas. It is that formula. And the way you regulate burn rate is just by bigger granules of powder. So you'll have F, double F, triple F. You get the idea of different sizes of the kernels of black powder to adjust the burn rate. But you can only adjust it so far. It's very low pressure unless you do something crazy and blow your gun up. But it's generally pretty low pressure compared to modern firearms. Low velocity. So if you wanted more power, more punch, back in days of yore, you would go with a bigger caliber. That's generally how that worked. You'd only put so much powder in there without blowing your gun up. So you'd make a bigger caliber. That's why you see much bigger generally than you do today. Like a traditional, black powder caliber might be 50 caliber up to 68 caliber, right? So huge calibers. Black powder equivalent, something like Pyrodex, right, or something like Trail Boss, ballistical Pyrodex. It's pretty much a black powder equivalent that's not as corrosive, not as smoky, not as bad for your firearms, and much cleaner burning. So Pyrodex would be a black powder equivalent, but you could load it in the same traditional firearms. So a traditional one that's real popular for hunting and historic would be a Kentucky rifle. Or a Pennsylvania rifle, right? They're called a Kentucky rifle, but they were made in Pennsylvania by German immigrants. Very finely made for the time, very accurate. They were rifled, unlike most of the military guns of the day. The original, sharpshooter snipers and things like that were hunters. They came from hunting, and those German rifles, those Pennsylvania rifles, Kentucky rifles, were used in hunting, and they were adopted for the Revolutionary War for sharpshooting. But those kind of historical rifles. The Pennsylvania/Kentucky long rifle, very long, hence the name, and the much shorter, Hawkins rifle when they went out west. Popular in Western style stuff. It's what I was used to when I did the rendezvous and what I hunted with when I was younger. Or a Hawken type rifle. Those are very historic hunting firearms. Now for black powder, for the very historic stuff, not talking about the modern, in name only kind of thing. I'm talking about actual traditional. You have much, much older matchlocks. I'm not going to talk about that. Those are crazy old. You had matchlocks. You had wheel locks, which were pretty expensive. Never really caught on as much. Then you had flintlocks, which was a big step forward. The lock is the mechanism on the side, kind of like a lock, like a locksmith and stuff were that pretty much similar technology used in making those. I think that's why they got the name lock. But like a flint lock, it's a mechanical mechanism that throws flint onto a steel to cause a spark to ignite some black powder in the pan. You get your flash in the pan, then hopefully you get your ignition. That's your flint lock. Then quite a bit later, we got the percussion cap. And this is what you start seeing in the American Civil War and things like that, the percussion cap, which is basically, for all intents and purposes, a primitive primer. Same thing. I don't know if it's mercury fulminate or a different priming compound in there, but it's just a percussion cap. You hit it hard and it makes a flame, and that causes your powder to ignite quite a bit. Much more of a leap forward, much more of a sure ignition than your old flintlock system, but that's a percussion cap, and you'll see a lot of those commonly. If you're talking about practicality, the big difference is lock time. The time between you pulling the trigger, or dwell time, the time between you pulling the trigger and the shot actually firing. It's quite a bit longer, usually, unless you get a hang fire, quite a bit longer in a flintlock than in a percussion cap. Man, I wasn't sure that I was going to get a bunch of content out of black powder, but now talking about the intricacies of it, I might have to make it a multi-parter. But black powder, percussion caps. Now, very traditionally and for a very long, long time, the projectile was a round ball. It was a round ball slightly smaller than caliber, and you would use a patch. Sometimes with some spit on it, sometimes with some lube on it. But you would use a lead round ball with a patch. That was traditionally what you'd use for a long time. That was what you used in smoothbore muskets and what you would later use in rifles until I believe the first real one that caught on, I don't know if it was the first one, you could probably find something earlier, but the first one that caught on was the mini ball, or the Minier ball, named for a Frenchman. I think it's just called mini ball because it's easier to say, but I believe it's Minier, a Frenchman that invented that, which was one of the first projectiles that looks like a modern bullet, kind of. Like if you saw it, you'd be like, oh, that's a bullet, because it pretty much looks like a bullet. These, again, came into common use historically in the Civil War along with the percussion cap, and they were massively devastating, and the technology was outpacing the tactics, and it led to huge casualties. But, much better than a round ball as far as ballistics go. They also let you load faster because they would go subcaliber, they would ram in pretty easy, and then the back of them were hollow and they would expand into the bore diameter. Going back to, if you're using them today, you're probably going to shoot a Hawken type rifle or a Kentucky type rifle anywhere between 36 to 54 caliber. Those are the common ones. If you, depending on the type of firearms history you want, you can shoot a Kentucky long rifle with a patched round ball. People still hunt with those. You can do it. Obviously, better ballistically is going to be something like a Hawkins and a 50 caliber with a maxi ball, which is like a modern version, Thompson Center version of a mini ball, or some kind of bullet-shaped projectile, right? Those are going to do better ballistically. If you start talking about sabos, they are better, but then you're kind of in this, what are you doing hunting with a traditional rifle with a sabo? You might as well just go with a modern inline. If you want to stick with history, kind of you're stuck in that, maxi ball, black powder or black powder equivalent percussion cap. That's about as good as you're going to get and stay historic, right, before we started going to modern cartridges. Now, I guess that we should talk about the transition period. There was a time when we were getting metallic cartridges, but we hadn't yet gotten smokeless powder, right? The 4570 is a classic, example of this. So you could, if you wanted to stay historic and you didn't care about the extra season or whatever, you could hunt with black powder 4570. I really would not advise that because it's really bad on guns. I wouldn't want you to take your modern gun. I would say do a black powder equivalent that's not corrosive. Do Pyrodex or something, unless you just really want. If you spent any time shooting or competing with black powder, as I have, it's a giant pain in the butt. It's a big reason I don't do it anymore. It's just nasty. Like anytime I got to break out a bunch of soap and water and sponges and stuff, and giant brushes to clean my gun after I've shot it 3 or 4 times, kind of takes the fun out of it, right? I like to shoot a lot. You have to clean black powder guns a lot. Where was I going with that? Oh, if you're going to shoot black powder, like I would encourage you to shoot an alternative, but you do you. It's your gun. But if you wanted to stay historic, you could load a black powder or black powder equivalent in a 4570. And there's a lot of historic cartridges like that. The 5070, which predated it, right? There's 5070, there's the 4570, the 4590, the 45110. A lot of historic black powder cartridges, which made the transition into smokeless. I'm not the expert in this. There's a lot more than that. I believe like the 3855 started out as a black powder cartridge. The first one, and this would have been the very tail end of the 1800s, the very first commercial smokeless load that I'm aware of would have either been, for us, right, there other countries were way ahead of us in this, but for America, it would have been the 3030, 1894 or 5, I believe, and the 3040 Krag, right around the same time. The 3040 Krag being our first, commercially, or not commercially, that would have been the 3030, our first military smokeless powder cartridge. But anything prior to that, you have that transition period from, muzzle loaders, but you go into the metallic cartridges that are still black powder. And that's the thing. People still do that. People still compete in that. Metallic cartridge black powder shooting is a thing. It's not something I've ever competed in, but it is a discipline, and it is something to look at if you want. Where this might apply to us today is that you can load modern firearms with black powder if you have to. Why might you want to do this? If you're talking about way deep down in the apocalypse rabbit hole, right? I'm a survivalist, a prepper. I don't shy away from that. If we get really, really long into the apocalypse supply chain issues, like where modern ammunition is not being produced, well, as I alluded to, it's really easy to make black powder. Like compared to, like, you have to be a master chemist with a lab to make modern smokeless powder. If you could even do it, if you could even source all the chemicals, right? But you can make black powder in your backyard with your own urine, which, who doesn't want to do that, right? So black powder is super easy to make. So you can make your own powder, and you can make your own primers if you know what you're doing, your own percussion caps, or you can reuse primers. There's ways to do that. So you can make your own ammo on your own, and it's pretty easy to cast lead, which is the kind of projectiles you're going to use for this stuff anyway, right? So why is that relevant today? You could load a lot of cartridges in a lot of guns, not all, but many modern firearms. You could reload them with black powder. You can obviously reuse the case. You can make your own primers. You can make your own black powder. So you could, if you had to, again, I wouldn't tell you to do this day to day, but you could load a 45-70 with black powder. It's going to be back to like the original loadings, right? Fairly pedestrian velocity, but it's plenty powerful enough. You could also, like a revolver in .38 Special, now you're probably only going to be able to shoot it so much before you have to clean it, but it's better than not having any gun at all. So you could load a .38 Special with black powder. People do it. You could load, assuming it's a manually operated firearm, right, like a bolt-action rifle, you could load a bolt-action .30-06 with black powder and cast lead bullets. It wouldn't be anywhere near as good as a modern .30-06. You might have to even make your own gas checks out of something, right? Out of brass or copper or something. That may be beyond the scope of this, but you could do it. You could certainly do it. You could certainly make a black powder .30-06 or a black powder .30-30 load. Again, I would don't advise you doing this day to day, but you certainly could do it. And it certainly would be a deadly for defense or for deer hunting. It wouldn't be anywhere near as good as a modern .30-06 or a .30-30, but it would be okay. It would work. So that's kind of a still relevant if you want to get deep down into the the prepper rabbit hole, right? Maybe you want way back in your gun safe. Maybe you want like a break open single shot .357 .38 Special because you could load it with black powder. Reload it pretty easily with black powder. Also relevant, convicted felons, and I think it's all convicted felons, but I could be wrong on that. By God's grace, it does not apply to me, so I don't have to worry about it. But they can't own firearms. Well, a black powder gun is not a firearm. Now, not what I just talked about, but like an old black powder gun or a reproduction is not a firearm. So you could get a cap and ball. That's another thing that people like to shoot and compete with. It's not really used for hunting, but like a cap and ball revolver. Well, that's still a 6-shot repeating firearm, right? Like an old Samuel Colt reproduction. A lot of Italian companies make them. This is not something I have much experience with. I've never shot a cap and ball revolver, but they exist, right? And you're still talking like a .38 caliber, 6-shot repeating firearm. It's better than nothing. If you can't own an actual firearm, it's not legally considered a firearm because it's not per their own rules, the ones that make the rules up. It's not a firearm. So somebody that maybe wrote a bad check and was a felon when they were 19 years old and now they're 40 and they want some way to protect themselves and they legally can't own a firearm, they could own one of these. Is it great? No. Is it is even as good as a modern revolver? No, it's not. And I'm not a big fan of carrying a modern revolver if you can carry a full-size, combat handgun. But, man, it's better than nothing, right? Better than a sharp stick, better than your pocket knife. Now, don't confuse, look up your legislation, make sure you're good to go on that. But now this does not apply. Like you can't get a modern gun and load it with black powder. That's not what I'm talking about. But an actual like cap and ball revolver or reproduction, I believe reproductions are the same. They don't qualify as firearms. Like you could go on to a website right now, I believe, and order a black powder handgun and have it shipped right to your house. Why? Because it's not a firearm. Now, other companies and stuff may have a policy that doesn't do that, but you should be able to buy one without a background check, without anything, because it's not a firearm. Going back to the hunting, right, if you could always do archery or crossbow or whatever. Those are also not firearms. But if you want to hunt and you have that background where you can't get a firearm and you want to put food on the table for your family, that is an option, right? It is an option. You get a 50 caliber Hawken and hunt. Even if there's no special muzzleloader season, you can still hunt in a firearm season unless there's some law against it. I don't think there is, with a Hawkins rifle. So again, if your background precludes you from owning a firearm, then that is an option. There's also black powder shotguns. Obviously, the common gauges we have today, the 12 gauge at least, for sure predates modern smokeless powder. So there are black powder shotguns. So you could do the same thing with either for hunting or defense. If you had to, you could get an old school, not a new and loaded with black powder. That would be a felony. But you could get an old school muzzle-loading shotgun in common gauges and use that. Right? You could hunt with it. You could hunt fowl with it. You could hunt pretty much anything you'd hunt with a 12 gauge with it, because the original 12 gauge was a black powder. Is it going to be as good as a modern firearm? No, of course not. That's why we use modern firearms. But it's okay. Right? You could certainly get a 12 gauge or a 20 gauge muzzle loading shotgun and hunt squirrels with it, or ducks or anything else, right? You just got to clean it more often. You use Pyrodex or whatever, but it's an option, right, if you wanted to. Actually, of all the things I've talked about, that's probably the most intriguing to me, because I haven't done it, and I do love shotguns. Like an old muzzle-loading shotgun would be pretty cool. Also, on that note, there's kind of a weird crossover, the L.A.P.D pistol. And these, I believe, were used in India against tigers, but it's like a double-barrel pistol that's like a shot. I believe they're in 410. They could be in other things, but it's kind of a shotgun double-barrel pistol thing that is not an ATF no-no, because it's black powder, non-firearm. But L.A.P.D pistols are pretty cool. I think you can still get repros of those. Also might be something worth looking into if you're interested in those. L.A.P.D pistol. Pretty neat. Make sure they qualify as not a firearm if that's important to you. I don't know if they do or not, but they should if they're an actual reproduction of an original design and it predated, 1898, if my memory serves. But anyway, just some cool stuff in the black powder world. I think I've rambled on enough. Yeah, black powder. It's a whole world unto itself. There's a lot to it, as you might imagine. I barely scratch the surface of a bunch of these different categories. But with that, we'll roll into the tactical tip of the day. You got to clean your black powder guns. I mentioned that, but I'm really going to reiterate. If you're not used to it and you think, I can just shoot, like your regular rifle, I can just shoot my 308 and I'll clean it in a week or two. Don't do that with black powder. You shoot it once, you had better clean it. Black powder is corrosive. It attracts a bunch of stuff that will break down a firearm. You have to clean it. You have to clean it. You have to clean it. Hot soapy water and then oil. But it takes a lot of cleaning, even after a few shots. So you need to clean it. That's your tactical tip. Don't get one of these and just shoot it and not clean it like it's a modern firearm. Now, I know a lot of people just clean a modern firearm after every time they shoot it. Maybe that's because of the tradition of black powder. You don't really have to do that with a modern firearm. But with a black powder gun, you absolutely do. So make sure that you clean that. Again, hot soapy water, and then follow it up with some oil. Does not necessarily need to be gun oil, because you might use a lot of it, but any good protective oil should work. Also, another tactical tip, something we would do in competition shooting with black powder, so we can shoot a little bit longer between cleanings. Cream of wheat. You can look that up, but you put a little bit of cream of wheat in your black powder. That's a thing. I'm not sure how much it actually works, but I think it probably does something, because the guy that knew more than me about it and got me into it, he showed me it, so I did it. But cream of wheat in your black powder. All right, with that, your tactical verse of the day. Red letters today. Therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who builds his house on the rock. And the rains descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. My thoughts here. Whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, right? And does them. Not just hearing them, but actually doing them, walking it out. The straight and narrow, right? So that's my thoughts on that. With that, guys, thanks for listening and have a blessed day.